Something subtle shifts the moment you stop living on autopilot and actually watch yourself. Not your life, you, your thoughts, your reactions, your inner movements. And when it happens, it can feel unsettling, almost unreal. Patterns you never questioned begin to repeat in front of your eyes. The same emotions, the same situations, different days, same outcomes. It starts to feel like you're inside a loop you never chose. And here's the strange part. No one ever told you this could be interrupted. Why is that? If inner observation is so powerful, why was it never taught in school? Why isn't it central in religion, psychology, or even most spiritual paths? Instead, you were taught what to think, how to behave, who to follow, but never how to observe. Something essential was left out. Not by accident, but by omission. Today we're going to uncover what happens when you turn your attention inward, and why this quiet ability changes everything once you see it. Most people believe they know themselves because they think about their lives all the time. They analyze what happened, replay conversations, imagine different outcomes, judge their own reactions. But inner observation is not that. Thinking about yourself is not the same as observing yourself. In fact, they are almost opposites. Inner observation begins when you stop trying to fix, explain, or control what you feel, and simply notice it. It's the moment you realize you can watch your thoughts instead of being dragged by them. Like sitting in a movie theater, seeing scenes unfold on the screen without jumping into the film. The thoughts still appear, the emotions still arise, but something subtle shifts. You are no longer fused with them. This is why inner observation feels strange at first. It creates a small distance between what happens inside you and who you are. And that distance is powerful. Not because it suppresses anything, but because it reveals something most people never notice. There is a silent presence behind every thought, every emotion, every impulse. When you feel anxious, inner observation is not saying, "I shouldn't feel anxious," or "Why am I like this?" It's noticing, anxiety is here. That's it. No judgment, no story, just awareness. And in that simple act, anxiety already starts to change. Not because you fought it, but because you saw it clearly. This is what makes inner observation so different from self-analysis. Self-analysis lives in the mind. Inner observation happens before the mind reacts. It's not verbal, it doesn't need explanations, it's direct, immediate, almost raw. You notice the tightening in your chest, you notice the rush of thoughts, you notice the urge to react, and you stay present. At first, this presence may last only a second. Then the mind pulls you back into the story. That's normal. Inner observation is not about staying present forever. It's about returning, again and again. Each return weakens the automatic patterns you've been running for years. And here's the part no one really explains. Inner observation is not passive, it's deeply active, just not in the way you were taught. Society trained you to act, decide, react, perform. But observation activates a different kind of intelligence, a quiet one that doesn't rush, one that sees clearly before moving. When you observe your mind, you start to notice how repetitive it is. The same worries, the same judgments, the same fears wearing different masks. You realize that most of what you call your personality is actually a loop, a program, and you've been executing it automatically. Inner observation interrupts that loop. The interruption may feel subtle, almost insignificant, but it's not. The moment you see a thought as a thought and not as truth, its power weakens. The moment you notice an emotion without feeding it, it stops growing. This is why observation changes everything without forcing anything. And yet many people misunderstand this and think observation means detachment from life, becoming cold or indifferent. It doesn't. In fact, it does the opposite. When you observe yourself, you become more present, more sensitive, more real. You feel emotions more clearly, but they don't drown you. You act, but not blindly. There's another layer here that's even more uncomfortable to face. Inner observation reveals how little control you actually have when you're not observing. How often you speak without choosing your words. How often you react from old wounds. How often your decisions are driven by fear, not clarity. Seeing this can be unsettling. The ego doesn't like being seen. It prefers to believe it's in charge. That's why most people avoid inner observation without realizing it. It exposes the mechanics behind their behavior, and once you see them, you can't unsee them. But this exposure is not a punishment, it's liberation, because you cannot change what you do not see, and you cannot be free while living unconsciously. Inner observation doesn't ask you to become someone else. It asks you to become aware of who you are being, moment by moment. That awareness is the doorway. Without it, every attempt to change remains superficial. And this leads directly to a crucial misunderstanding that keeps almost everyone stuck. The belief that thinking equals consciousness. Most people assume that because thoughts are happening, they must be aware. But are they really? Or are they just being carried by the noise? That question, who is watching the thought, is where things start to go much deeper. One of the biggest misunderstandings people carry is the belief that thinking means being conscious. Because thoughts are constant, loud, and familiar, they assume this inner noise is awareness itself. But thinking is something that happens within consciousness. It is not consciousness. And this confusion quietly controls the way most people live. From the moment you wake up, thoughts appear automatically. Plans, worries, memories, judgments. They come without effort, without permission. Because they are always there, you identify with them. You say, "This is me," without ever questioning it. But if thoughts were truly consciousness, who would be noticing them? This is where the illusion begins to crack. The fact that you can notice a thought means there is something in you that is not the thought. There is a silent observer behind it. Yet most people never rest there. They jump from one thought to the next, mistaking movement for awareness. The mind loves this confusion. When you believe you are your thoughts, you become predictable. A memory triggers an emotion triggers a reaction reinforces an identity, and the cycle continues. You call it my personality, but in reality it's conditioning repeating itself. True consciousness doesn't argue, it doesn't comment, it doesn't explain, it simply sees. Thought, on the other hand, is always narrating. It labels, compares, justifies, fears. When you confuse the narrator with the awareness listening to it, you lose access to your inner freedom. This is why so many people say they are aware, yet remain trapped in the same patterns for years. They think about their problems constantly, but they never step out of the thinking itself. They analyze their anxiety while still being inside it. They judge their anger while being driven by it. That's not observation. That's the mind talking to itself. Consciousness is quiet. Not empty, but quiet. And because it's quiet, the mind often feels uncomfortable around it. Silence leaves no place to hide. So thought rushes in to fill the space, convincing you that being busy mentally equals being alive. But notice this, the most intense moments of clarity in your life probably didn't come from thinking. They came when thought stopped for a second, in awe, in shock, in deep focus, in presence. In those moments, there was no commentary, only awareness. That's consciousness revealing itself naturally. When you confuse thought with consciousness, you live reactively. Every external event pulls an internal string. Someone says something, a thought appears, an emotion follows, and you're already responding before you even realize what happened. It feels automatic because it is. The mind is excellent at creating the illusion of control. It tells you stories like, "I chose this," or "This is just how I am." But look closely and you'll see how fast reactions happen. There is barely a gap. That gap, or the lack of it, is the difference between unconsciousness and awareness. The common mistake is not having thoughts. Thoughts are natural. The mistake is believing every thought, following every impulse, and calling that consciousness. When you do that, life runs you instead of you living life. This confusion also explains why people resist inner observation. Observation threatens the mind's authority. If you discover that you are not your thoughts, then the old identities lose their grip. The victim story weakens, the compulsive patterns become visible, and that can feel destabilizing at first. So the mind defends itself. It distracts you. It keeps you busy. It convinces you that you already know this, that understanding it intellectually is enough. But intellectual understanding changes nothing if awareness doesn't deepen. Consciousness is not something you do, it's something you notice. And the moment you notice it, you realize how often you've been on autopilot, mistaking mental activity for presence. This realization can be uncomfortable, even humbling. You start to see how many of your daily actions are driven by unconscious habits rather than choice. How many reactions happen before awareness arrives? And that's when another truth begins to surface, one that explains why so many people feel trapped without knowing why. Because once thought is mistaken for consciousness, the entire system runs automatically. And without noticing it, you start living on autopilot. Once thought is mistaken for consciousness, something subtle but powerful takes over your life, the automatic cycle. Most people don't notice it because it feels normal. It feels like who I am. But in reality, it's a loop that runs quietly in the background, shaping your days, your decisions, and your reactions, without asking for your permission. The cycle usually starts the moment something happens around you. A message, a look, a tone of voice, a memory. Instantly, a thought appears. That thought carries a meaning. The meaning triggers an emotion. The emotion pushes you to act or react. And once you react, the result reinforces the original thought. The loop closes and prepares itself to repeat. This all happens so fast that it feels like a single event. You don't experience it as steps, you experience it as reality. They disrespected me. This always happens to me. I knew it wouldn't work, but if you slow it down with observation, you begin to see the mechanics behind the experience. The danger of this cycle is not that it exists. The mind is designed to create patterns. The danger is that the cycle runs unseen, and what runs unseen runs your life. Think about how many times you've reacted in a way you later regretted, not because you're a bad person, but because the reaction happened before awareness arrived. By the time consciousness showed up, the words were already spoken, the decision already made, the damage already done. Over time, these repeated reactions create habits. Habits harden into identities. You start saying things like, "That's just how I am," or "I always do this." But what you're really describing is a program that has never been interrupted. This is how the cycle sabotages you daily, not through dramatic events, but through small repetitive moments. The tone you use when you speak, the assumptions you make about others, the way you judge yourself silently. These micro-reactions shape your relationships, your confidence, and even the opportunities you allow yourself to see. The cycle is comfortable because it's familiar. Even when it causes pain, it feels known, and the mind prefers the familiar over the unknown. That's why people often stay stuck in patterns they claim to hate. The pattern gives them a sense of identity, even if it costs them peace. Another reason this cycle is so powerful is because it creates the illusion of logic. The mind always has a reason, a justification, a story. I reacted because they deserved it. I didn't try because I knew the outcome. The story makes the reaction feel reasonable, but reason doesn't equal awareness. When you live inside this automatic cycle, life feels repetitive. Different faces, same emotions, different situations, same endings, and eventually you start to feel tired without knowing why. Drained, like you're pushing against something invisible. What you're really pushing against is your own unconsciousness. The cycle also feeds on speed. The faster your life is, the easier it is for the program to run. Notifications, deadlines, opinions, noise, all of it keeps you from noticing what's happening inside you. The cycle thrives in distraction. This is why inner observation feels so disruptive to it. The moment you observe, the cycle slows down. A pause appears, and in that pause something new becomes possible. But until that pause exists, reactions feel inevitable. Most people try to change their lives by changing external conditions, new routines, new goals, new environments. But if the internal cycle remains untouched, the same patterns simply follow them into the new setting. This is also why motivation alone doesn't last. You can be motivated in the morning and sabotage yourself by the afternoon. Not because you lack discipline, but because the cycle is stronger than intention when it's not seen. The automatic cycle doesn't need to be destroyed. It doesn't need to be fought. it only needs to be noticed. Because the moment you see it operating, it loses its invisibility. And what is no longer invisible no longer has absolute control. But there's another layer here, one that explains why breaking this cycle feels so difficult in the first place. The cycle doesn't operate in isolation. It's constantly being fueled by something else, something external, something designed to keep your attention moving outward, not inward. And that's where the next realization begins. There is a precise moment when something unusual happens inside you. It doesn't look dramatic from the outside. No one else notices it. But internally, the rhythm changes. The moment you observe yourself, truly observe, everything begins to slow down. Life usually feels fast because reactions are fast. Thoughts rush in, emotions surge, words come out, actions follow. One thing triggers another with almost no space in between. It feels like momentum you can't stop. But observation introduces a pause, and that pause changes the entire experience. Imagine feeling anger rise. Normally, it takes over immediately. Your body tightens, your mind justifies, your mouth prepares to respond. But if, in that moment, you notice anger is arising, something unexpected happens. The anger is still there, but it no longer fills the whole space. It loses urgency. It loses speed. This doesn't mean the emotion disappears instantly. It means you're no longer being carried by it. You're standing slightly behind it, watching it unfold. And from that position, time feels different. Seconds stretch, breathing deepens, the internal pressure eases. The slowing down is not psychological trickery. It's a shift in attention. When you stop feeding a reaction with identification, it has less energy to sustain itself. Reactions thrive on unconscious participation. Observation withdraws that fuel. This is why inner observation feels like regaining control. Even though you're not controlling anything, you're simply present. And presence naturally decelerates the internal chaos. Most people live in a constant state of inner acceleration. Even when they're physically still, their minds are racing, planning, worrying, replaying. Observation interrupts that speed. It grounds attention in what is happening now, not what might happen next. And here's something important. Slowing down doesn't make you passive. It makes you precise. When you're not rushing internally, you see more clearly. You hear what's actually being said. You sense what's really happening. Your responses become intentional instead of impulsive. This is often misunderstood. People fear that if they don't react quickly, they'll lose power or miss opportunities. But the opposite is true. The most grounded people are not the fastest reactors. They are the clearest observers. When you observe, you begin to notice subtle details that were invisible before. The exact moment a thought tries to pull you into a story, the physical sensation that comes before an emotional outburst, the familiar pattern announcing itself before it repeats. These details only become visible when things slow down, and slowing down creates choice. Without observation, there is no choice. There is only habit. The reaction feels inevitable. This is just how I am. But when you observe, you feel the space between impulse and action. That space may be brief at first, a heartbeat, a breath. But it's enough. Enough to not say the thing you'll regret. Enough to not follow the same old path. Enough to act differently. This is why people often describe observation as calming. But it's not calm because life becomes easier. It's calm because you stop fighting what's happening inside you. You allow it to be seen without immediately interfering. That acceptance relaxes the nervous system. There's also a deeper layer to this slowing down. When you observe consistently, your sense of time itself begins to change. Days feel less rushed. Moments feel fuller. You stop feeling like life is constantly slipping away from you. Presence anchors you. But this new pace can feel uncomfortable at first. When everything slows down, you become more aware of what you've been avoiding. Restlessness surfaces. Impatience appears. The urge to distract yourself grows stronger. That's not a failure. It's a sign that observation is working. The mind is not used to being watched. It's used to running freely. When you observe, it tries to speed things back up. It creates urgency. It pulls your attention outward. It convinces you that something else needs your focus right now. This is where many people unknowingly abandon observation, not because it doesn't work, but because something keeps pulling them away from it. And that raises an important question. If observing yourself slows everything down and gives you freedom, why does it feel so hard to sustain? Why is your attention constantly being dragged outward? Why does distraction feel almost engineered into daily life? The answer lies in forces that most people never stop to question. Once you begin to observe yourself, something becomes very clear. Staying present is not easy. Your attention doesn't just drift by accident. It's pulled, again and again, almost as if something doesn't want you to remain still long enough to notice what's happening inside you. Distraction today is not random. It's constant, layered, and everywhere. A sound, a vibration, a headline, an opinion, an urgency. Even when nothing is happening, the mind looks for something to latch onto. And most people never question why. When you are distracted, you are not observing. And when you are not observing, the automatic cycle runs uninterrupted. That's the real function of distraction. It keeps you moving outward so you don't look inward long enough to see the patterns that control you. These forces don't need to be dramatic or sinister to be effective. They work precisely because they feel normal. Productivity, entertainment, information, even self-improvement when done compulsively can become another form of escape. As long as your attention is occupied, the inner world remains unseen. Notice how rare silence has become. The moment there's a pause, something fills it. Music, a screen, a thought. Silence makes people uncomfortable because silence exposes what distraction hides. It brings unresolved emotions to the surface, old fears, unanswered questions, and most people would rather scroll than feel. Distraction also creates the illusion of progress. You feel busy, stimulated, involved, but busy doesn't mean conscious. In fact, busyness is often the perfect cover for unconscious living. You can be extremely active and completely absent at the same time. One of the most subtle distractions is urgency. Everything feels important. Everything feels like it needs your attention now. This constant pressure fragments your awareness. You move from one thing to the next without ever fully being anywhere. Observation requires presence, and presence requires time. Urgency steals both. There is also social distraction, opinions pulling you in different directions, expectations shaping how you should think, feel, behave. When your attention is constantly reacting to others, you lose contact with your own inner signals. You begin to live from external references instead of internal clarity. And then there's the distraction of identity. Roles you play, labels you carry, stories you repeat about who you are. These identities keep you occupied defending, proving, and maintaining an image. Observation threatens these structures, because once you see them, you realize they're not as solid as you thought. This is why sustained observation often triggers resistance. You sit quietly, trying to observe, and suddenly the mind floods you with thoughts, plans, memories, doubts. It's not a failure of discipline. It's a defense mechanism. The mind has learned that distraction equals safety, because when you truly observe, you start to see uncomfortable truths. You see how often you avoid certain feelings, how often you seek validation, how much of your behavior is driven by fear instead of choice. Distraction protects you from seeing this, but it also keeps you trapped in it. Over time, constant distraction dulls sensitivity. You stop noticing subtle shifts in your body, your emotions, your intuition. Life becomes louder but less meaningful. You consume more but feel less fulfilled, and you don't know why. The invisible forces are not just external. They operate inside you too. The urge to check, the need to stay stimulated, the discomfort with stillness. These are learned responses, reinforced daily, and they only have power when they go unnoticed. The moment you see distraction as a pattern, not a personal failure, something changes. You stop blaming yourself. You begin to observe the pull itself. And just like with emotions, observation weakens the grip. But here's the part that almost no one talks about. When distraction loses its power, something else takes its place. Awareness doesn't just bring calm, it brings clarity. And clarity reveals what has been hidden beneath the noise. When you finally stay present long enough, without escaping, without numbing, Without scrolling away, deeper layers begin to surface. Feelings you pushed aside, truths you avoided, parts of yourself you never fully faced. And that's where the next phase begins. There comes a point in observation where it stops feeling calm and starts feeling revealing. At first, observing yourself brings space, relief, even a sense of control. But if you stay with it, if you don't escape, something deeper begins to happen. You start to see things you were not prepared to see. Not because they suddenly appeared, but because they were always there. Deep observation doesn't show you who you wish you were. It shows you who you have been acting as, the fears behind your decisions, the attachments behind your reactions, the silent motives you never questioned. And this can feel unsettling, even uncomfortable. You may notice how often your actions are driven by the need for approval, how certain emotions trigger defensiveness almost instantly, how old wounds still influence present choices. These realizations don't come as dramatic revelations. They come as quiet recognitions, and those are the hardest to ignore. One of the first uncomfortable truths people encounter is how much avoidance shapes their lives. Avoiding difficult conversations, avoiding silence, avoiding feelings that feel too heavy. You start to see how distraction was not just entertainment, it was protection. Another truth that surfaces is the gap between intention and behavior. You might believe you value honesty, presence, or compassion, but observation shows moments where fear overrides those values, where you choose comfort over truth, where you react instead of listen. Seeing this can bruise the self-image you've been protecting. The mind often responds to these discoveries with resistance. It tries to justify, to explain, to minimize. Everyone does this. It's not that bad. But deep observation doesn't argue. It simply shows. And the more honestly you look, the harder it becomes to lie to yourself. This is why many people stop observing right here. Not because observation failed, but because it worked. It exposed the patterns that were quietly running the show. And facing them feels risky. If you see them clearly, you can no longer pretend they don't exist. Another uncomfortable truth is how repetitive the inner world can be. The same emotional responses, triggered by different situations, the same stories replayed with new characters. Observation reveals how little has actually changed internally, even when life looks different on the outside. This realization can bring sadness, a sense of wasted time, moments where you see how long you've been reacting from the same place, and the mind may rush to fix it, to improve, to become someone better. But that urgency is just another escape. Deep observation asks for something else. Honesty without self-punishment, seeing without condemning. This is difficult because most people equate awareness with judgment. But judgment closes awareness. It turns observation into another form of control. When you observe without judgment, something important happens. The uncomfortable truths lose their sting. Fear doesn't need to hide. Desire doesn't need to pretend. Pain doesn't need to shout to be heard. Being seen is enough to begin transforming them. And this is the paradox. What you avoid controls you. What you observe loses its grip. Still, this stage can feel lonely. You may realize that many of your reactions were unconscious, that some relationships were maintained out of habit rather than presence, that certain dreams were shaped by fear of disappointment. These insights don't make you superior, they make you more human. There is also a deeper layer many people don't expect. Observation reveals not only fear, but longing, unexpressed desires, creative impulses suppressed for safety, needs you learned to ignore. Seeing these can be just as uncomfortable as seeing fear, because they ask something of you. At this point, life begins to feel different, not lighter yet, clearer. You start noticing how the inner world shapes the outer one, how your state influences how others respond to you, how certain situations dissolve when you no longer meet them from the same internal place. And slowly, almost without effort, you begin to sense something curious. As your inner awareness deepens, the way the world responds to you begins to shift. It feels subtle, almost like coincidence, but it isn't. At some point, after you've been observing yourself consistently, you start to notice something strange. Situations that once triggered you no longer have the same effect. Certain conflicts don't escalate the way they used to. People respond to you differently, even though you haven't consciously changed your behavior. It feels subtle, almost accidental, but it keeps happening. The reason is simple, yet rarely understood. The outer world has always been responding to your inner state. Most interactions are not shaped by words alone. They are shaped by tone, presence, tension, expectation. Before you speak, something is already being communicated, and that something comes from inside you. When your inner world shifts, the signal you emit shifts with it. When you live unconsciously, your reactions carry charge. Fear underneath your calm, defensiveness beneath politeness, expectation beneath effort. Others feel this even if they can't explain it. They respond to the charge, not the story you're telling yourself. Inner observation changes that charge. When you observe your thoughts and emotions instead of being driven by them, your nervous system settles, your body relaxes, your presence becomes steadier, and people sense that stability. They feel less pressure to react, to defend, to compete. This is why conversations begin to feel different. You listen more, not because you decided to, but because there's space inside you. You're not rehearsing responses while the other person speaks. You're actually there, and presence invites presence. The outer world also reflects your level of clarity. When you're no longer fighting your inner experience, you stop projecting that fight onto life. Problems don't vanish, but they stop feeling personal. You respond instead of resist. That shift alone dissolves many conflicts before they form. There's another layer to this change. Observation breaks identification. When you're not identified with every thought and emotion, you stop taking things as personally. Criticism doesn't wound the same way. Praise doesn't inflate you the same way. You become less reactive and more grounded. This changes the dynamics around you. People who were used to provoking reactions may stop trying. Situations that relied on your old patterns lose their grip. Opportunities appear where resistance once lived. From the outside, it can look like luck, like timing, like coincidence. But internally, you know it's alignment. Your actions are no longer contaminated by unconscious motives. You choose more cleanly. You speak more clearly. And clarity is magnetic. The outer world also changes because your perception changes. When you're not trapped in mental noise, you notice possibilities you once ignored. You see openings instead of obstacles. You sense when to act and when to wait. This isn't intuition as a mystical concept. It's perception unclouded by fear. And as your perception sharpens, your choices become simpler. You stop forcing outcomes, you stop chasing validation, you stop repeating what doesn't feel right. Life responds to this honesty. This can feel destabilizing at first. Some relationships may shift, certain roles may no longer fit. When you change internally, not everything can stay the same externally, and that can bring discomfort. But observation doesn't remove difficulty, it removes confusion. You see what aligns and what doesn't, and seeing clearly changes what you tolerate. There's also something deeper at play that many people sense but struggle to articulate. When you observe within, your attention becomes coherent, less fragmented, less scattered, and coherence creates influence, not over others, but over how situations unfold around you. You stop pushing against life, and life stops pushing back as hard. This is why ignoring inner observation keeps people trapped in repetition. They try to change outcomes without changing the internal state producing them, and then they wonder why the same themes keep returning. But as the outer world begins to shift, another realization quietly follows. You start to see what happens to those who never observe at all. How patterns repeat endlessly, how time passes without real movement, how life becomes a loop instead of a journey. And that awareness brings a new kind of urgency. Ignoring your consciousness doesn't feel dangerous at first. That's what makes it so effective. There's no alarm, no sudden collapse. Life keeps moving. You wake up, go through your routine, make decisions, react to situations. Everything seems functional. And yet, something subtle is being lost every day. The real danger is not pain, it's repetition. When consciousness is ignored, patterns take over completely. The same emotional responses appear again and again, just dressed in different situations. You think you're moving forward, but internally, You're circling the same points. Different people, same conflicts. Different goals, same frustrations. Time passes, but nothing truly changes. This is how life slowly becomes mechanical. Without awareness, reactions harden into habits. Habits solidify into identity. You start saying things like, "This is just who I am," without realizing you're describing unconscious conditioning. At that point, life is no longer lived, it's executed. One of the most serious consequences of ignoring consciousness is the loss of choice. When you're not aware, decisions don't come from clarity, they come from fear, comfort, urgency, or old wounds. You don't choose, you repeat. And repetition slowly drains meaning from life. This is why so many people feel tired even when nothing dramatic is happening. It's not physical exhaustion, it's existential fatigue. The feeling of living on autopilot, day after day, without real presence, without depth. Another danger is emotional accumulation. When feelings are not observed, they don't disappear, they stack. Unexpressed anger becomes tension. Unseen sadness turns into numbness. Ignored fear quietly dictates behavior. Over time, the body carries what the mind refused to see. And then people wonder why anxiety appears for no reason. Why motivation fades. Why joy feels distant. The reason is not mysterious. Consciousness was neglected for too long. Ignoring awareness also distorts perception. When you're unconscious, you don't see situations clearly. You see them through filters, past experiences, assumptions, projections. You react not to what's happening now, but to what once happened. Life becomes a series of misunderstandings. This distortion affects relationships deeply. You hear words but respond to tone. You see actions but interpret intentions that aren't there. Conflicts escalate not because of facts, but because of unconscious reactions colliding. Over time, this creates isolation. You feel misunderstood, disconnected, even surrounded by people, and you don't know why. There is also a more silent danger: wasted potential. When consciousness is ignored, intuition is drowned out, creativity stays dormant, inner intelligence is never accessed. You follow paths that feel safe but empty. You silence impulses that could have led to growth because they feel uncomfortable. Years later, regret appears, not as a dramatic crisis, but as a quiet question. How did I get here? Ignoring consciousness doesn't ruin your life overnight. It erodes it slowly. It turns days into routines, emotions into reactions, and existence into maintenance. And perhaps the most painful part is this: without awareness, you don't even realize what you're missing. You adapt to the numbness. You normalize the repetition. You call survival life. But something inside you knows. That subtle discomfort you feel sometimes, the sense that something is off, even when things look fine, that's consciousness trying to be noticed. Those who ignore it don't necessarily suffer more. They just evolve less, they repeat longer. They stay stuck in loops they can't see, and the loops don't break on their own. The difference between those who remain trapped and those who begin to move is not intelligence, luck, or effort. It's awareness, the willingness to observe. Because the moment consciousness stops being ignored, something powerful happens. You stop reacting blindly. You stop explaining yourself endlessly. You stop leaking energy into unconscious patterns. Observation stops being something you do occasionally and becomes something you carry with you. And when that happens, observation transforms into something else entirely. There comes a moment when observation is no longer something you practice intentionally. It stops being an exercise. It becomes a state. You don't sit down and remind yourself to observe. You simply notice. And from that moment on, something changes in how you move through life. Observation becomes silent. You no longer announce it to yourself. You no longer analyze what you're doing. There is just awareness, quietly present in the background while life unfolds. And this is where observation turns into a secret weapon. Not because it gives you power over others, but because it gives you power over yourself. When observation is stable, reactions lose their grip. Not all of them disappear, but they no longer dictate your behavior. You feel the impulse to speak, but you don't feel owned by it. You sense irritation, but it doesn't hijack your tone. This creates a calm authority that doesn't need to prove itself. People notice it. They may not know what changed, but they feel it. Your presence feels different. You're not rushed. You're not tense. You're not trying to control the situation. And that alone shifts the dynamic. Conversations slow down. Conflicts soften. Even silence becomes comfortable. This is why observation works best when it's invisible. The moment you try to use it as a technique, the mind wants results. It wants validation. But when observation is quiet, it works on a deeper level. It shapes your responses before you even choose them. Your words become fewer but more precise. You speak from clarity instead of reaction. You stop over-explaining. You stop defending unnecessary positions. Not because you're detached, but because you see what matters and what doesn't. This silent strength also shows up in decisions. You no longer feel pulled in 10 directions at once. You sense when something is aligned and when it isn't. The noise that used to confuse you fades. Choices become simpler, even when they're not easy. Another shift happens internally. You stop fighting yourself. Emotions are allowed to exist without being dramatized. Thoughts come and go without being chased. This inner peace is not passive, it's grounded. And grounded people are difficult to manipulate, rush, or destabilize. That's why observation is a weapon the world rarely teaches. It doesn't create consumers. It doesn't create followers. It creates individuals who are harder to control because they are aware. When you observe consistently, you stop leaking energy into unconscious loops. You don't replay conversations as much. You don't imagine worst-case scenarios constantly. Your attention returns to the present moment naturally. And presence conserves energy. This conservation changes how you show up in life. You're not exhausted by every interaction. You don't feel drained after speaking your truth. You don't need constant reassurance. You trust your inner signals more. And yet this doesn't make you rigid. It makes you flexible. When you're aware, you adapt without losing yourself. You listen without disappearing. You stand firm without becoming aggressive. There is also a quiet confidence that grows, not the loud kind that needs recognition, but the calm kind that doesn't need approval. You stop seeking confirmation from the outside because you are anchored on the inside. This is why observation works best when you don't talk about it. It reshapes you from within, and the world responds naturally. But there is a final layer to this process, one that often surprises people. When observation becomes your default, you start noticing something about your entire life trajectory, about how long you've been looking outward for answers, about how early you were trained to seek guidance, rules, and validation outside yourself. And that realization opens the door to the deepest question of all. From a very early age, your attention was gently, and sometimes forcefully, directed away from yourself. You were taught to listen before you were taught to feel, to follow before you were taught to sense, to look outside for answers long before anyone suggested you look within. No one did this to harm you. It was simply the structure you were born into. Parents, teachers, systems, all of them emphasized rules, expectations, comparisons, rewards, and consequences. You learned what was right or wrong based on approval, what was valuable based on results, what mattered based on how others responded to you. Slowly, your center of gravity moved outward. And yet, the power you're now rediscovering was always there. As a child, you felt things directly. You sensed discomfort, curiosity, joy, fear, without explaining them. But over time, those signals were overridden. Don't feel that. Don't think that. Be like this. Do what's expected. And gradually, observation turned into obedience. Looking outward became a habit. You were trained to trust authority more than awareness, to trust opinions more than perception, to trust noise more than silence. And the more you did, the quieter your inner voice became. Not because it disappeared, but because it was ignored. This outward orientation shapes almost every adult struggle. People search for meaning in achievements, for peace in control, for security in validation. And when they don't find it, they assume something is wrong with them, instead of questioning where they've been looking. Inner observation was never encouraged because it doesn't depend on systems. It doesn't require permission. It doesn't need belief. It only requires presence, and presence makes you autonomous. When you finally turn inward, it can feel unfamiliar, even wrong. The mind says, "Shouldn't I be doing something?" That discomfort is conditioning speaking. You were taught that stillness equals laziness, silence equals emptiness, and inward attention equals escape. But it's the opposite. Looking inward doesn't disconnect you from life. It reconnects you to it. You stop chasing direction and start sensing it. You stop asking who to be and begin noticing who you are being in each moment. This is why reclaiming this power feels like remembering something ancient rather than learning something new. It doesn't feel foreign. It feels forgotten. You begin to notice how often you outsourced your authority, how often you waited for certainty before acting, how often you ignored subtle inner signals because they didn't come with guarantees. Observation brings those signals back into focus, and as they return, your relationship with the outer world changes. You still listen, you still learn, you still engage, but you're no longer dependent. External input becomes information, not identity. This shift can feel destabilizing at first. When you stop relying entirely on external guidance, you must take responsibility for your own awareness. There's no one else to blame, no one else to follow blindly. That freedom can feel heavy before it feels empowering. But slowly, trust builds. Not blind trust, grounded trust. You learn that you can sit with uncertainty without collapsing, that you can feel deeply without losing control, that you can observe confusion without becoming confused, and in that space, something profound settles in. You realize that the power to change your inner state was never missing. It was simply never pointed out. You were trained to manage life from the outside in instead of from the inside out. Observation reverses that direction. It brings authority back to where it belongs, not in rules, not in beliefs, not in others, but in awareness itself. And once this understanding takes root, the question is no longer whether observation works. The question becomes something much simpler and much more personal. What actually changes when you begin to live this way every single day? When you begin to observe yourself daily, life doesn't suddenly become perfect. It becomes clear. You stop waking up already pulled by yesterday's emotions. You stop reacting before you understand what's happening inside you. Little by little, presence replaces urgency. You start noticing your thoughts without believing every one of them. You feel emotions without being consumed by them. Peace doesn't come from controlling the world. It comes from seeing yourself fully without running away. And that changes how you move, speak, decide, and relate. Daily observation creates space. Space to choose, space to pause, space to respond instead of repeat. The chaos outside may still exist, but it no longer owns you. Clarity becomes your anchor. Try this simple experiment. For the next 7 days, observe yourself without judging. Notice your reactions. Notice your breath. Notice when you want to escape. Don't fix anything, just see. Then notice what shifts. If this message reached you, write, "I am observing" in the comments so I know you stayed until the end. And if this resonated with you and you want to go deeper, choose one of the videos appearing on your screen now. This is where the journey continues.